My colleagues and I like to refer to ourselves as paranormal researchers, the key word being researchers. Oftentimes, I find myself misrepresented by those ghost hunters you see on television. I try not to have an elitist mindset, but those types of individuals create an exaggeration of the profession. More often than not, it seems like they are in it only for personal gain. I started this small organization with a few like-minded friends nearly a decade ago. We all came together to seek out answers, if there were answers to be found, to uncover the unexplained, and attempt to understand the various natures of those mysteries. To say we had some difficulties getting started would be an understatement. For the first year of our meager inception, we all mostly hung around and leafed through some sparse accounts of paranormal incidents, the majority of which proved to be dead ends, until one week in the fall, barely a year after we had begun, we happened across our first real claim. It was after that encounter that I began to document our research into the various accounts. Casefile Subject 01 started with a request submitted to our message board. It was from a young man who had recently purchased a house but refused to live there. He mentioned he was in the process of actively trying to sell the location, but in the meantime, he was searching for answers or some explanation to strange occurrences that had been happening there. We had received numerous reports along the lines of, "My X, Y, and Z is haunted," and after many fruitless endeavors, I began to ignore most submissions. However, something about this one stuck out to me. Perhaps it was him not outwardly saying it was haunted, or the fact that he had been living in a hotel for the better part of the month. But I brought it up with my colleagues and we all agreed to go take a look. It was better than sitting around anyways. We arrived at the house in the middle of the day and the owner greeted us outside. He told us that he had been experiencing strange occurrences, things being knocked off of shelves, temperatures plummeting at odd intervals, and the visage of a woman appearing around the house at night. Honestly, it sounded like your average ghost story. But the way the man looked at the house with a pure terror that forbade him from moving any closer roused my curiosity. We thanked him, got the key, and began to set up for the night. For the majority of the day, nothing happened while we sat around in his small living room. It wasn't until the sunlight left the sky did odd things begin to occur. We looked around every room when suddenly one of our group called us to an office at the back of the house. We all gathered over there, and immediately upon entering, I noticed frost stretching across the window. I demanded everyone remain still and began to scan the room for any type of electromagnetic signatures. My eyes were too focused on the device to notice another person was standing in the room with us. A ragged breath of freezing air passed in front of my vision, and when I glanced up, I saw her. She stood before me with eyes like two white marbles, skin reminiscent of decaying flesh, and white hair that hung loosely in front of her face. I felt my voice catch in my throat, but somehow I managed to speak to her. I asked her what she was doing here. Her face withheld any sign of acknowledgement to my words. She then raised a withered hand towards me, and I instinctively wanted to run away. My muscles, however, were seizing up, forbidding me from moving. My crew surprisingly held their ground as well, probably out of fear or shock. The woman touched my cheek, and a burning sensation drifted through my skin. I then started to get visions in my mind, flashes of a woman staggering alone in a blizzard outside. She collapsed in a forest before succumbing to the exposure. My body began to shake uncontrollably, and when my sight returned to me, I noticed that she was now pointing out of the window, pointing towards the trees outside. She vanished before our eyes shortly after. After taking a very long time to collect our thoughts, we all discussed on what we should do. Some were still in shock over the whole ordeal, and some wanted to just get the hell out of there. The next morning, we contacted the owner and explained to him what had happened. He asked us what he should do, and I truly didn't have an answer for him. This too was our very first experience, and we had little answers for him. Still, he expressed his gratitude in knowing that he wasn't insane, and told us he was still just going to sell the place. We thanked him for contacting us and for allowing us into his home. We packed up our gear and left not long after. That single experience gave us all the drive to continue our work, to continue searching for more unexplained phenomena. Though, despite our eagerness, our findings have been sparse. For nearly a decade, we've only verified and documented 9 separate accounts so far. This most recent one has shaken me and my crew to our very foundation, however. Casefile Subject 09 was something we as a group had been tracking for quite a few months. I've elected not to give file numbers to anything I haven't personally witnessed, so up until then we just called it the Lurker. Not a very creative title, I'll grant you, but it was just a nickname we tossed around. There were many reports of an unsettling creature stalking the rural recesses of the Pacific Northwest. At first, we just discounted them as blatant rumors. People who knew someone who saw something weird. Eventually, one submission from that area caught my eye. It was from a woman who lived in Washington. She detailed spotting something unexplainable on numerous occasions outside her small house in the woods. I tried to gather more information, asking if she was sure it wasn't just some wild animal, and her response was actually quite plain. That wild animals don't typically have human-like faces. I gathered the team and we made our way out to the location. We met with the woman and she walked us around her property. She pointed out where she had spotted it. She said she would look out of her kitchen window and see it crawling on all 4s across her yard, before disappearing into the woods. We asked her if we could set up our truck on the edge of her property to investigate the area, and she happily obliged. Once the sun was beginning to set, we quickly got to work gathering our camera equipment and scanning the woods near us. A few hours passed and we saw no hint of anything abnormal. Although I didn't imagine we would find something immediately, the waiting around was wearing on us after our long journey. So I suggested to the crew that we venture out and see if we could spot anything of interest. They agreed, so we fanned out and pushed our way into the brush. We all walked for nearly an hour into the dense foliage, trying our best to keep our wits about us. I was just about to call it quits when one of our group whispered for me to come over. I slowly crunched my way over towards him, and he drew my attention off to the side a few yards away. I couldn't believe it. There was what looked to be a small shack, sitting in between a mess of trees. As we all got closer, it seemed to be a long abandoned cabin of sorts. The doors and windows were long since missing, and all that obscured the interior was a grimy curtain that clung to the frame. I motioned for everyone to follow me quietly as we moved up to the entrance. I peeled back the curtain on the door and looked inside. I was surprised to find the interior extended pretty far inward. Various debris was littered about as most of the building was crumbling at the seams. 2 of us stepped inside, and I looked around. The shack seemed empty, not even a sign of any animal living here, let alone a paranormal one. I tapped my crewmate on the shoulder and told him we should head back and look around outside. He nodded, and just as we turned, I felt something hit my shoulder. I touched my shoulder and pulled my hand away quickly, as a grimy tar-like substance was coating my hand. We both looked up, and directly above the doorway, right above our heads, was the outline of something pressed against the ceiling, like a spider trying to hide in the corner of a room. Its body was long and gangly. It was using its slender arms to wrap themselves around the fractured planks of wood. I shined my flashlight up to get a better look at it, and I wish I hadn't. Its torso was narrow, barely the width of an ironing board. Its feet had these hook-like claws that reminded me of the velociraptors in Jurassic Park. But despite its grotesque form, once I looked at its face, I could not look at anything else. Its head looked nearly identical to an anglerfish. It had small, black, beady eyes, but the majority of its head had thousands of needle-like teeth. My colleague took a hesitant step backwards, and when he did, I watched its head snap to face him, almost like it was tracking his movement. This sudden fixation caused my colleague to panic, and he attempted to make a break for the door. The creature released its grip on the wood and fell upon him. I called for the others to help us quickly, and they rushed in upon a gruesome scene. That creature was digging its fangs into his legs and stomach multiple times. It was trying to eat him alive. Two of the others that entered ran up and kicked the creature off him, and we all dragged him out of there as fast as we could. Just before we left eyeshot of the shack, I turned back once more, and that horrifying face was watching us flee from the shadows of that doorway. We ran back to our van and had that lady call 911 for us. The paramedics asked us what happened, and we told them that we were attacked by a bear in the woods. They gave each other curious looks before taking our friend away in the ambulance, and the rest of us just sat there, blood-soaked and defeated. The woman turned to us and asked us what was out there, knowing full well we just lied to the paramedics. And all that I could manage to say was to not go into the woods after dark. Thankfully, our colleague made a full recovery, but our morale suffered a severe hit after that. A few of us decided they were done with this endeavor, and I'll be honest, I'm considering that path as well. But I would be lying if I didn't mention how fascinating it was to find a creature like that. Subject 09 made all of the previous subjects look inconsequential by comparison. Depending on whether or not I decide to continue my research remains to be seen. But one thing's for certain. I will never, ever forget my encounter with Subject 09.